Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we begin with chapter 13 of Bram Stoker's 1897 classic novel Dracula, and buckle up because not only am I going to attempt to cover more of this book tonight than we have covered in any two previous sessions combined, but I also have a hard out in only 90 minutes. So this one is going to go to the wire, ladies and gentlemen. So let's get started. This week, the tragic end of Lucy Westenra, the rehabilitation of Jonathan Harker, surprising as it may be, and the ongoing balancing act between skepticism and belief in a rational age. We begin chapter 13 then with the investigation of Lucy's papers and various belongings by Seward and Van Helsing, all while Lucy's ethereally beautiful body lies in repose. Van Helsing tells Seward that tonight Lucy will be preserved so that Arthur can see her, or it, as he conspicuously corrects himself the next day, and then Seward and Van Helsing must work together to, casually sever the head and remove the heart. We're going to take a look here, I guess. I've tried to limit my slides tonight, but there's so much good Van Helsing this week, you guys. We're going to talk about Van Helsing actually in just a moment here. So Van Helsing assures Seward that he has acted as he believed that he must. And he repeats the end of the last chapter where he prevented Arthur from kissing Lucy and was therefore thanked by her, by some part of her, by the human part of her, we might speculate, in return. Then he offers the justification not for his actions, but rather for his words to Seward. Let's take a look at this slide. John, my child, you have been my good friend now many years, and yet did you ever know me to do any without good cause? I may err, I am but man, but I believe in all I do. Was it not for these causes that you sent for me when the great trouble came? Yes. Were you not amazed, nay, horrified, when I would not let Arthur kiss his love, though she were dying, and snatched him away by all my strength? Yes. And yet you saw how she thanked me, with her so beautiful dying eyes, her voice too so weak, and she kissed my rough old hand and blessed me. Yes. And did you not hear me swear promise to her, that so she closed her eyes grateful? Yes. Well, I have good reason now for all I want to do. You have for many years, trust me. You have believed me weeks past, when there were things so strange that you might have well doubt. Believe me yet a little, friend John. If you trust me not, then I must tell what I think, and that is not perhaps well. And if I work, as work I shall, no matter trust or no trust, without my friend trust in me, I work with heavy heart and feel, oh, so lonely, when I want all help and courage that may be. He paused a moment and went on solemnly. Friend John, there are strange and terrible days before us. Let us not be two, but one, so we work to a good end. Will you not have faith in me? Now this sets us up beautifully for what is going to be a major part of tonight's ongoing conversation. This tension between the closed and the open mind, and I'm phrasing that very carefully because it's oftentimes presented, particularly in adaptation, as a conflict here between, credulity and science, or credulity and rationality, perhaps between science and faith, but this isn't season 2 of Lost. This is a much more subtle and in some ways complicated and in some ways much more simple and straightforward narrative work, because we are not, as we move through the rest of this book, going to meaningfully undermine rationality. Van Helsing, doctor, lawyer, scientist of some sort as he is not going to say that, well, actually, there is science, yes, and science is all well and good, but really there's also magic. What he's saying is, there are limits to things that we believe. There are boundaries that we have placed upon our experience of the world, that Seward has placed upon his experience of the world, that blinds him to certain things, and that is why the science fails. It is not because science is insufficient, because rationality is insufficient. It is because Seward is possessed of prejudice, because Seward believes certain things to be hard dividing lines in the world, when in fact they are not so. And you'll see that even here, right? In this building of a step-by-step rational argument that Van Helsing goes through here. He reiterates first all of the activities and, crucially, their consequences. Was it not for these causes that you sent for me when great trouble came? Look, you knew why you called me, right? Something mysterious was going on and you called for my help. And you know who I am. We have been friends for many years and you have trusted me through all this time. So you must have known that there was something that was challenging not just your personal circumstance, not just your immediate, relationships, but something that challenges your sense of what is possible in the world. Were you not amazed, nay horrified, when I would not let Arthur kiss his love? Yeah, of course you were. That's a completely natural response. But then look how it played out. Was she not grateful in the end for what I did? Did I not, in a sense, prove myself right? And you can note the kind of implicit appeal to authority here, right? He's pulling in Lucy as a witness to his character and a testifier as to the efficacy of his actions here. But he's still, throughout, as I say, building this strictly rational argument from a strictly rational perspective. Van Helsing does not believe that there are impossible things. He believes that there are things that Seward is ignorant of. He believes that there are things that Seward has no space in his world picture for. There are more things in heaven and earth, etc. Right? I think that it's important to understand what it is that Stoker is doing and, in effect, whose side Stoker is on, if we're going to appreciate what there is to appreciate in the back half of this novel, particularly once we move, well, really past, but even up to the moment of Lucy's final terminal punctuation. This is followed by the odd detail of the stolen crucifix. You'll remember that Van Helsing places the little gold crucifix on Lucy's lips. And I don't know what this is or what is supposed to be happening or what the immediate consequence is. And there's a problem, I think, particularly if you are a modern lover of vampire fiction, right? If you are here in the 21st century, just steeped in all the various varieties and flavors of vampire lore, it can be frustrating to read Stoker because he doesn't play it straight. He doesn't communicate the rules of these particular vampires, right? He doesn't play straight exactly what the boundaries of each skill. Forgive me. See, even there, I'm using the word skill, right? Because I'm being reminded of our earlier conversation about Dracula's D&D character sheet, as though he possessed discrete powers, each of which can be, entirely and comprehensively enumerated. Partly, this is Stoker pushing back, I think, against this Victorian desire for the comprehensive novel, right? We talked a little about this back in our Dickens unit on Great Expectations. And in the years between Great Expectations and Dracula, this desire, I think, has only accreted, it has only kind of solidified itself. We're about to see, from Stoker's perspective, we're about to see the rise of modernism and the rejection of this idea that every story, every piece of art, in fact, must be thoroughly comprehensive. There must be no unanswered questions. It must be complete and unified in and of itself. Stoker seems to be pushing back against that. And I mentioned, I think, in last week's lecture, how in part that desire leads not to the modern vampire tradition, but to his immediate inheritors, people like H.P. Lovecraft and the tradition of cosmic horror, the tradition of a horror that does not account for itself in the same way as modern vampire fiction tends to do, for example. So we're going to continue to look at that as we move forward, but all of this is to bring it back to focus on that crucifix. I don't know what the intent of the crucifix was. Clearly, okay, let's acknowledge the various elephants in the room. There's a lot of symbolism at play here. There is the symbolism of the crucifix itself, of course, useful to ward off vampiric energy, to ward off evil in some slightly indefinable way. There's also the mouth, right? There's the ancient belief, the ancient collection of beliefs that at the moment of death, the soul escapes the body from the mouth, that this is where the soul passes from. But there also doesn't seem to be a question that Lucy is not dead. So perhaps are we guarding against something coming into Lucy? Presumably we're not guarding against anything so stark and objective and powerful as the Count himself. It seems that if that were the case, Van Helsing would take stronger precautions that could not be, casually pocketed by a maid and then discovered in the aftermath. But I'm not at all sure what exactly we are to make of that. The only clue, I suppose, is this idea that it's now too late to perform the procedure. The surgery feels weirdly inappropriate. The post-mortem, the autopsy, as our American cousins say. It's now too late to do that, or too early, right? We are now in some kind of middle state where something is happening within Lucy, but then that kind of removes the symbolism of the crucifix upon the lips as being a guard or a barrier if this transformation is now occurring within her. We can speculate all day, all night. We could speculate, in fact, for 100 years. We can put together a body of academic work on the works of Bram Stoker and still not come up with a satisfactory answer. So we're going to move on in the interests of expediency here. We're presented, though, with another mystery almost immediately, though it is a more pedantic and technical one. Mr. Marquand, the solicitor, informs Seward that against his advice, Mrs. Westenra left her estate not to her daughter, but rather to Arthur Holmwood. Marquand points out here, quote, "Frankly, we did our best to prevent such a testamentary disposition and pointed out certain contingencies that might leave her daughter either penniless or not so free as she should be to act regarding a matrimonial alliance. Indeed, we pressed the matter so far that we almost came into collision, and she asked if we were or were not prepared to carry out her wishes. Of course, we had then no alternative but to accept. We were right in principle, and 99 times out of 100 we should have proved by the logic of events the accuracy of our judgment. Frankly, however, I must admit that in this case, any other form of disposition would have rendered impossible the carrying out of her wishes. For by her predeceasing her daughter, the latter would have come into possession of the property, and even had she only survived her mother by 5 minutes, her property would, in case there were no will, and a will was a practical impossibility in such a case, have been treated at her decease as under intestacy, in which case Lord Godalming, though so dear a friend, would have had no claim in the world." And I don't, unfortunately, have time to delve into the technicalities of this and exactly what it is that Stoker is trying to communicate here, save to, I guess, observe that this is property that is held by Lucy's mother in her own name, in her own hands, and that this is a relatively modern phenomenon, right? The women's property laws in England were passed in 1870, 1882, and the last in 1893. Those were the legal acts that made it possible for women to, own property, both while married and while single. So this desire of Mrs. Westenra to pass all of her property not to her daughter, but to Arthur, is kind of bewildering, right? It's kind of baffling, and I don't really know how to get to the bottom of it, except that it adds another mysterious sack onto the pile of mysterious sacks that comprise our understanding of Mrs. Westenra. She is enigma piled on enigma, and all of this might be some proof of some, intervention by Dracula, some manipulation of Lucy's mother by the Count himself, but if so, then it is too subtle for me to properly unpick and understand. But it is nonetheless odd. I just can't quite get to it because the women's property laws were controversial at the time, and this may be another element of Mrs. Westenra's kind of conservative disposition, right? She is very careful. She does not seek to trigger her own health crisis, right? She is aware of the weakness of her heart and doesn't seek out any excitement or adventure past that, and is protected by the people around her too, of course. I'm feeling the shape of something under the surface of this book, and I'm unable, unfortunately, to get to it with any precision. So if you have thoughts on why it should be that Mrs. Westenra passes all of her possessions, her entire estate, not to her daughter, but rather to her daughter's fiancé, besides just a kind of political conservatism, but I don't know. At the same time, that feels impossible to me and also kind of inescapable. Just imagine a world in which an older woman of a senior generation sincerely believes that her daughter should have fewer rights than she herself has enjoyed. What a world that would be. The direct and unambiguous consequence of the will, though, is that she is, comprehensively, effectively disinheriting her daughter, but actually in reality that Arthur Holmwood has grown his own estate following the death of his father quite significantly and absolutely immediately. All of this, I suppose, I should note, kind of unfolds in the shadow, both of these elements that we've discussed so far, right? The theft of the little gold crucifix and its recovery from the maid who took it, right? The theft from the lips of Lucy as she lies in repose, and the recovery of that crucifix by Van Helsing, and then this odd bit of property transaction. These both play into our suspicion of the household that we are inheriting from our discussion last week, right? The lacing of the sherry with the laudanum, for example, and all of these. Oh, I wanted to call that out, actually, because I got a couple of emails about it, finding it suspicious that the bottle of laudanum should be right next to the bottle of sherry. And why would you keep your bottles of, expensive poison right next to your bottles of fortified wine intended for the maids, right? You'll note here the class distinction that the maids are given the sherry when they are distraught, but everyone else drinks brandy, by the quart. That is the preferred medicinal beverage in this period for people of class and character. So the maids drink the sherry and it is laced with the laudanum, but we can both explain the presence of the laudanum and its position in the room through reference to the text here. This is the quote from Lucy's final diary entry, quote, "The decanter of sherry on the table was half full and there was a queer acrid smell about it. I was suspicious and examined the decanter. It smelled of laudanum, and looking on the sideboard, I found the bottle which mother's doctor uses for her, did use, was empty." So this is laudanum that has been prescribed for Mrs. Westenra, and it was kept on the sideboard, right? A place where you would respectably keep medications and such things, rather than on the table with the sherry itself specifically. So I don't think that it's necessarily suspicious. Its use is obviously suspicious, but its presence perhaps is not necessarily incriminating there. In any case, let's move on. Arthur arrives to see Lucy's body. There's a touching scene where we acknowledge his grief at the loss of his father, his would-be mother-in-law, and his fiancée in the span of just a couple of days. And from there, on the 22nd of September, 2 days after Lucy's death, Mina writes from the train to Exeter about her experience in London with Jonathan. And again, throughout this, we see Mina's excellence. She opens by enumerating the things which have happened, right? Like we get a brief recap of recent events, Whitby and Jonathan being missing and reuniting in Budapest and the moment of happiness that they have and the death of Mr. Hawkins. And then says, quote, "I am rusty in my shorthand. See what unexpected prosperity does for us. So it may be as well to freshen it again with an exercise anyhow." And then she proceeds to strive as ever for self-improvement. Mina Harker, ladies and gentlemen. I am perhaps more on board with Van Helsing's judgment of Mina Harker than I am of any other character in the book. I think that she is terrific. Okay, let's take a look at her entry here. Quote, "I was looking at a very beautiful girl in a big cartwheel hat sitting in a Victoria outside Juliana's when I felt Jonathan clutch my arm so tight that he hurt me and said under his breath, 'My God!' I am always anxious about Jonathan, for I fear that some nervous fit may upset him again, so I turned to him quickly and asked him what it was that disturbed him. He was very pale, and his eyes seemed bulging out as, half in terror and half in amazement, he gazed at a tall, thin man with a beaky nose and a black moustache and a pointed beard, who was also observing the pretty girl. He was looking at her so hard that he did not see either of us, and so I had a good view of him. His face was not a good face. It was hard and cruel and sensual, and big white teeth that looked all the whiter because his lips were so red, were pointed like an animal's. Jonathan kept staring at him till I was afraid he would notice. I feared he might take it ill. He looked so fierce and nasty. I asked Jonathan why he was disturbed, and he answered, evidently thinking that I knew as much about it as he did. 'Do you see who it is?' 'No, dear,' I said. I don't know him. Who is it?' His answer seemed to shock and thrill me, for it was said as if he did not know that it was to me, Mina, to whom he was speaking. 'It is the man himself.'" End quote. Carlo Giuliana was an Italian jeweler working in London from 1860 to his death in 1895, 2 years before the publication of this novel. His famous store opens in Piccadilly in 1865, and after his death, the store moves to Knightsbridge in 1911, then closes in 1914. His work, though, is still extremely highly regarded. More importantly than his legacy, this is a pop culture reference intended to ground the experience of the reader, many of whom would know this place personally, and many more of whom, I should say, would know it by reputation. So, what do we see here? Well, the obvious, right? Dracula is here. He is in London, much to Jonathan's shock. He is younger than ever. This is 2 days after Lucy died. He is youthful. His hair is now black, right? You'll remember the progression from white to grey to black with shots of white in it as he's talking to the zookeeper before Berserker goes mysteriously absent from the Regent's Park Zoo. And now just black. But Mina can still see his essential nature. She can still read this cruelty, this hardness, and the sensuality too, right? This combination of these sharp, pointed, white teeth and the full red lips is, very communicative and, in fact, an enduring symbol of Dracula specifically, but vampires in general too. What else do we see here? Well, we also see that Jonathan remembers everything that happened to him in Transylvania. He at least remembers the appearance of Dracula. It returns to him all at once as the Count is presumably staring with a predatory instinct at the very beautiful girl in the big cartwheel hat sitting in a Victoria, that is in a two-wheeled carriage outside Giuliano's. The other thing that we notice here that I think does not always go observed is that Dracula is unaware of Harker's influence here. We talked a little, it may have been last week when we were talking about the miasma which accompanies Dracula, right? This creeping sense of evil, the thing that contaminates the castle and the surrounding countryside in Transylvania, the thing which we might speculate consumes the crew of the Demeter and drives them from the safety of that ship into the wild white water. That this is perhaps not entirely under Dracula's control. And here we see that the Count apparently has no sense that Harker is there. He cannot feel this man with whom he was so familiar for several months very recently. He has no sense that he's there. This seems to be a moment of Dracula's malevolent miasma kind of undermining the Count himself, or betraying the Count himself might be a better way of putting that. We'll also note here that we're going to be spending an increasing amount of time, I suppose, as we move through the back half of this book, kind of tangenting around Seward and the the Victorian concept of mental health and mental illness, I should say. And we'll just assert again that we are working with this Victorian schematic of mental health that is not modern, that is not good, that is not admirable, that ought not to be, repeated or considered really valid in the modern world. When we're talking about, the insane, we're talking about crazy people. We're talking about people who are defined by their inability to actually apprehend the limits and the boundaries and the systems and the workings of the world, right? And you'll see a certain similarity there. I'm kind of skipping ahead in our discussion here, but you will see a certain similarity there between people who are considered crazy by the standards of Dr. Seward and his lunatic asylum and Seward himself, according to Van Helsing, right? Renfield, for example, has this particular perspective on this world, this particular set of beliefs, which he then follows through in a fairly rational manner. If you accept that Renfield's zoophagous nature is good and virtuous and will in fact lead to increased life, then Renfield is behaving properly. He's behaving rationally. He is kind of being led in accordance with his own belief system. Seward is the same. What is the difference between Seward and Renfield? They are drawing the lines in very different places. Now, obviously, this is not to suggest that Seward is secretly, as bad, as corrupt, as dangerous as Renfield is. But we might think back to Seward's somewhat incomplete sense of character when he was talking about the inward push and the outward push, the centripetal and the centrifugal force, right? How those two things remain in balance. It seems as though that may be somewhat incomplete for the living of a virtuous life. We might speculate here, too, that Dracula is, of course, interested in the beautiful young woman in the Victoria as his next mark, as his next victim. It's unclear, as it remains unclear pretty consistently throughout this book, how often Dracula has to feed, how much it is a necessity, and how much it is a pleasure, but certainly he seems to be setting his mark on a new target there. One of the more interesting moves, actually, just to stick with Jonathan Harker for a moment, one of the more interesting moves that Stoker makes in this book can be found in this relatively brief section where, because of the trauma that he has suffered and the consequences of the trauma that he has suffered in Transylvania, Jonathan disappears as a protagonist of the book, right? This entire account is from Mina's perspective. This is literally, we are witnessing events from Mina's perspective, but we're also getting Mina's written account after the case, right? She's going back and remembering this and presenting it for us, her reader. And yeah, we'll get to Jonathan's entries later in this week's reading, rather imminently, in fact. But it's interesting that he is bumped to this peripheral position because of his loss of agency, right? There is a commonality between his ability as a man, as a person in the world here, and his role in the narrative, right? When he is deprived of both awareness and agency by the story, he disappears from the role of the aware, agentful, agent, I suppose, the aware agent, in a narrative sense, right? He slips away from that and regresses into the periphery, allowing Mina to come in and compensate for that. And yeah, I mean, all the better for it because Mina's terrific, as I say. Jonathan immediately forgets that he remembered, and Mina resolves to break her earlier promise, because promises get broken in Dracula, you guys, and to read his super secret journal, which is, another way in which Stoker is playing very advanced games, executing very advanced maneuvers with the epistolary nature of this novel, because it's not just a collection of documents. We're going to see in tonight's reading, in fact, the compilation of the book so far. Both Mina and Jonathan will undertake specific journeys to acquire the documents that we have already read and to compile them into a unified document of a sort. So the creation of the epistolary novel is itself a part of the unfolding of the epistolary novel in a way that is actually, I think, surprisingly rare. I don't think that you can think of things like House of Leaves, where that is also true, right? The unfolding story is self-reflexive, but it's self-reflexive upon itself from different levels, from different perspectives. There are different tiers of narrative, and people above the core story can look into the core story and comment upon it. But the core story is not really building the own accounting of itself in the way that Dracula is. And I think that this is, I rejected soundly the assertion that Dracula is, the first epistolary novel in the English language, because by more than a century, in fact, Dracula is nowhere near the first epistolary novel. This is a very common form by the time that we get to Dracula, which means, again, that author's note way back at the beginning is doing something more specific and is doing something more ironic, I think, particularly as we continue to look so carefully at this text and to look so carefully at the ways in which these documents fit together imperfectly, right? It starts to make more sense that the timeline is as fragmented as it is if we learn that actually it's Jonathan and Mina that are putting this book together. And what is important to them is not the same as the nominal author function to which we were attributing the compilation of this book back in earlier sessions in this unit. And certainly not, they do not have the same desire as internal archivists, narratively internal archivists, as Bram Stoker, author of this book, has. So I find it, again, just really compelling and interesting to play with those different levels and to see how sophisticated Stoker is in his approach to this text. Let's move on. Here we're back then all at once with Seward and Van Helsing. Arthur confesses that he feels as though he were married to Lucy because of the transfusion, and everyone else looks awkwardly at their shoes. Will absolutely make a pact never to tell Arthur this secret either. The secret will also be revealed in very short order. They depart. Van Helsing has his fit of hysteria, quote very much, unquote, and talks at length about the power of King Laugh, which I would absolutely excerpt here with delight, had we but world enough and time. It is a weird little segue, but I have a great deal of affection, as I've said before, for Abraham Van Helsing. It's worth noting here that we are leaning a great deal on the significance of the blood, right? The transfused blood that was placed into Lucy and then, removed from Lucy. We have this semi-ironic conclusion, this I don't know, rather romantic idea, I suppose, from Arthur Holmwood, that he and Lucy are married in a sense, that they are one in a sense because they have shared this intermingling of blood. But if that is true, then so are Seward and Van Helsing and even Quincey Morris. But we might think too of what happened to that blood, of its ultimate destination after it lingered a while within the veins and arteries of Lucy Westenra. It has passed on to Dracula. And if it is true, as Arthur, and by implication the other three men too, if it is true that there is a bond between them and Lucy because of this transfusion, then there is by extension a bond between them and the Count himself. We'll be sensitive to that, I think, as we move forward through the rest of this book. But certainly it's going to be a little more difficult to determine than just the complex geometry of a blood-based polycule, I guess. Van Helsing observes that he ought to be pitied more than the others because enigmatically he knows the truth. And then we get another flourish of the epistolary form with Seward somewhat ostentatiously concluding his diary, right? Just deciding, well, Lucy is dead, and that's very sad, and obviously, terrible things have happened in the world, but yep, that's a wrap. That's probably the end of this book, so I'm going to really take center stage to conclude my journal and put it away for good. That too will, of course, return almost immediately. From there, we get the accounts taken from the Westminster Gazette. And again, the archivist compiling this document is more than willing to play with the irony, it seems. We're describing the Bloofer lady here, and the accounts taken and pretty comprehensively disregarded from the children, the working class children of Hampstead. And we can, read the Victorian mind there quite clearly, I think, in that these accounts are doubly insubstantial because they come both from children and from working class children at that. But nonetheless, we get the accounts of the Bloofer lady, right? The beautiful lady, and some weird... I don't completely understand how Stoker gets to Bloofer. I'll lay that out there. And I'm generally a fan of his somewhat enthusiastic approach to communicating written dialect here on the page. We'll remember Mr. Swales and so forth. But Bloofer, I can't quite hear it as a Cockney Hampstead kind of corruption of beautiful. It doesn't ring completely true to me, but still, that's apparently the association there. And of course, this is all folded in with this ongoing parodic journalistic voice that Stoker so enjoys. He does not, we can be absolutely certain at this point, as we get our third installment here of journalistic reportage, he clearly has no time for journalists in general. Particularly with this passing little turn of the knife right at the end here, right? A quote, "There is, however, possibly a serious side to the question, for some of the children, indeed all who have been missed at night, have been slightly torn or wounded in the throat." End quote. That's so buried, that lead is so buried that it appears at the very end of the second article on this subject. Children have been going missing at night, but then they turn up again and everything's just fine. And aren't these common children just strange and awful? Oh, also, the ones that have gone missing, every single one of them has a wound on the neck that is unaccounted for. Some things never change. Oh, I'll note, too, that Ellen Terry, who is mentioned in this excerpt as a kind of... archetypally attractive, beautiful, alluring woman. She was a real actress of the time. Moreover, she was a professional and romantic partner to Stoker's longtime business partner, business associate Henry Irving, and a close personal friend of Stoker's too. So this is a real, just name dropping his friend right here as the most attractive person in London, which I think is actually very cute. This is, contemporary reference enfolded within contemporary reference. Actually, contemporary reference enfolded within contemporary reference, enfolded within contemporary reference, because the Westminster Gazette, the paper from which these clippings are taken, is also a very new, modern, trendy, hip newspaper in Victorian London. It starts publication in only 1893, so it is still the new kid on the block by the time that Stoker is writing this novel. From there, then, into chapter 14, we're picking up the pace here. We open the chapter with Mina reading Jonathan's original journal. I love this sequence. I think it is so good. All of these, these eruptive emotional ellipses that are coming into Mina's account as she's writing about what Jonathan went through. It's so not Mina, right? Superficially, not Mina, but we can feel, I think, her good, reliable Victorian femininity trying to control her response. It feels very true to her character, right? Though not the character that we've seen previously, for sure. There's this great moment when Mina's grateful for Van Helsing's arrival because he'll be able to tell her about Lucy's illness and what happened to Jonathan, and she catches herself noting, quote, "This is the reason of his coming. It is concerning Lucy and her sleepwalking and not about Jonathan. Then I shall never know the real truth now. How silly I am. That awful journal gets hold of my imagination and tinges everything with something of its own color." Which is such a fascinating moment, right? Because we, the readers, I think, would skip over that completely. It's the kind of thing that we've seen before in this book, right? You'll remember Jonathan asserting that he himself had never yet seen Dracula in the daylight, when in fact he had, right? He leaps to the conclusion of the drinking of blood without really, we can make some allowances for that one, but without really having concrete evidence that in fact is what is going to happen, that specific thing is going to happen. Characters infer a lot. And many critics of Stoker's work will take this as proof of careless writing, of sloppy writing, which, if you've read some of Stoker's other work, is more defensible than if you've just read Dracula. But I don't think that is what's happening here. I think because Mina is pointing it out here, right? Van Helsing is coming to her to talk to her about Lucy. In Mina's mind, these two things are completely separate. There is no correlation whatsoever between the awful things that happened to Jonathan in Transylvania and what has happened to Lucy in recent weeks. These two are just completely disconnected. But when Van Helsing says that he's coming to her, she immediately conflates the two. She immediately understands that no, there is a connection. And it is only after a moment that her rational mind reasserts itself and says, no, of course there isn't a connection between these two completely disparate things. It is the influence of the journal. That awful journal gets hold of my imagination and tinges everything with something of its own color. Tinges everything with something of its own color. A kind of miasma, would you say? A kind of fell influence that leads people who are sensitively inclined to draw connections between apparently, seemingly rationally disconnected things? I think this is all, in fact, proof of this theory of this dark cloud that surrounds Dracula as he moves through the world. Mina, again, calling on the inspiration of lady journalists, her patron saints of lady journalism, recounts her entire conversation with Van Helsing. And this is so lovely. Stoker's characterization for both, I think, is so sharp. It's so acute. It's so well observed. It's a little mannered in the way that two people who don't really know each other can be mannered around each other, right? There's a certain conspicuous observation of the formalities of courtesy and decorum here, which again is interesting because we're going to see that very much set aside later in tonight's reading. But it's also indicative, I think, of this turning to the procedural, the pedantic. This is what I mentioned a little bit in last week's reading. With the death of Lucy, and certainly with the imminent second death of Lucy, the book takes a different shape, right? We move into a kind of Gothic mystery, which for modern readers is perhaps less compelling because we know the shape of that mystery. We may not know the details. We may be still, shocked at the horror. We may be shocked at the individual images associated with that mystery, but we basically know the shape of what is happening. But the other thing that the book does is really start to unfold this very proceduralistic element, right? We're going to spend a lot of time talking about very specific trains. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how we get from place to place and what time should we meet and where should we have dinner and where people should stay overnight. And of course, we've been doing that for a while, particularly with regard to Lucy, right? The coming and going of the various men who orbit Lucy Westenra has been documented, but that's because we're on the clock. Or at least as readers, we might be forgiven for believing that that's because we're on the clock, because we're paying close attention to the passage of time and Lucy's ever worsening condition, right? The presence of Seward or Van Helsing in Lucy's home is actually important to the movement of the plot. Here it's not important, but we're still getting it. And what Stoker is doing is on the one hand just narratively building out this procedural element, right? This is going to be a feature and a fixture of storytelling for the next century and more. You don't get to CSI Miami. Wow, of all the things I could have picked, I picked CSI Miami. You don't get to CSI Miami without having this kind of foundation of proceduralism, right? This is the birth of modern policing. Of course, we're indebted to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle for really exploring that facet of Victorian rationality. We must, of course, move on here with our slide. We're just going to take a second to talk about this brief excerpt here. Yes, let me put this up as I check that I've got the right one. But doctor, you praise me too much, and you do not know me. Not know you? I, who am old, and who have studied all my life men and women, I who have made my specialty the brain, and all that belongs to him, and all that follow from him, and I have read your diary that you so goodly written for me, and which breathes out the truth in every line. I who have read your so sweet letter to poor Lucy of your marriage and your trust, not know you? Oh, Madam Mina, good women tell all their lives, and by day and by hour and by minute, such things that angels can read, and we men who wish to know have in us something of angels' eyes. I'm just realizing now, I think, that I have transposed 2 slides in my selection here, so I'm going to move on right now to frame out this discussion a little bit, because of course this is after Van Helsing has read all of Mina's papers and journals in this great kind of, you can imagine the kind of Rock Hudson, Doris Day split screen treatment of this in a 1960s camp musical comedy version of Dracula, as they are, Mina's kind of doing all of her research and Van Helsing's reading her journals, and then we split later and Mina's reading Seward's, I guess transcribing Seward's records on the phonograph as he's reading her journal, and it's all, but again, very pedantic, very kind of, very procedural as we're moving forward here. But I want to talk about this dude. Here we go. An unexpected slide here, I'm sure, because this, of course, is Van Helsing, albeit this is Gabriel Van Helsing, apparently no relation, from the awful, awful 2004 Stephen Sommers movie starring inexplicably Kate Beckinsale. Well, I guess, okay, kind of slightly explicably Kate Beckinsale and less explicably Hugh Jackman, both actors, by the way, who I really like. I bring this up not just, of course, for a moment of absurd comic relief as we approach the halfway point of tonight's lecture, but because I want to note my opposition to this reading of Abraham Van Helsing, right? I want to note my opposition to this steampunk badass version of Van Helsing, which seems to be the version that we get more often than not nowadays. I think that Van Helsing is such a rich and complex character, such an unusual character, particularly in modern fiction. And for him to be stripped down to this, or I guess actually replaced by this kind of much more traditional action hero version of himself, really costs us something, It is in Van Helsing's heart, not in his array of weapons and tools, not in his, command of secret knowledge, not in his force of will. It is in his heart that his power resides. It is in his courtesy and decency and courage, right? He is an old professor who just happens to be the perfect man for the job. And of all of this, I just find the diminution of Van Helsing in almost every single adaptation of Dracula to be somewhat depressing. And don't get me started about, Anthony Hopkins. Or I guess, do get me started about Anthony Hopkins, because my bonus episode on Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula will be coming out very soon. And let me say in advance that Keanu Reeves is not the problem with that film. He's not a high point of that film. You know what? I could actually do that entire episode, I think, just by listing each performance and giving it a score out of 10, and you would be able to infer from that my exact and precise opinions about that film as an exercise in adaptation. But we'll get to all of that if you would like to hear that episode as it comes out. Patreon.com/nextword, patreon.com/nextword for all of that. So we stuck a little, oh, you know what? The only good version of Van Helsing, Peter Cushing. I think that is the only one that really stands up to me. I'm sure you have different opinions. Dear listener at home, get in touch, starsandswordspod@gmail.com. I have no idea why this show tends to fall apart, you guys. It is an ongoing mystery to me why we can't ever really keep to our schedule. The most significant thing is the return to Jonathan's POV. We reestablished that within the bounds of this sequence because of Van Helsing's praise, right? This is an example, in fact, an inadvertent example of exactly what I'm talking about. It is Van Helsing's praise and reassurance. It is his humanity that, even by proxy, even at a distance, restores Jonathan's confidence, his faith in himself, his sense of the world, his sense of what is possible, right? He kind of comes back immediately to himself just because Van Helsing says, yeah, actually, all of that, pretty much true. And also, Jonathan is great. Don't you worry, he did a good job. Like, these things, sometimes I guess we all need that praise. And then we get that praise of Mina, which we just moved through. Van Helsing returns to town. He catches a glimpse of the Westminster Gazette as he's leaving, right? This great detail. The Gazette, which we've already seen the clipping from, was published yesterday at this point that Van Helsing sees it at the railway station. He says, mein Gott, so soon. We get all of this, ominous foreshadowing. And then we cut out to Seward's account and the language of cinematic cuts and transitions, a thing which I use perhaps a little too casually when I am describing the movement of a linear narrative in the form of a novel. But rarely is that language, the language of cinematic editing, more applicable than it is here, as Van Helsing literally walks out of one scene and then into the next scene. It really is a cinematic cut between these two places, dislocated in time and space, demanding that Seward, in fact, open his mind to what is happening. Let me call up, yes, This is the slide that I'm looking for. Do you know all the mystery of life and death? Do you know the altogether of comparative anatomy, and can say wherefore the qualities of brutes are in some men and not in others? Can you tell me why, when other spiders die small and soon, that one great spider lived for centuries in the tower of the old Spanish church and grew, till on descending he could drink the oil of all the church lamps? Can you tell me why in the Pampas, aye, and elsewhere, there are bats that come at night and open the veins of cattle and horses and suck dry their veins? How in some islands of the western seas there are bats which hang on the trees all day, that those who have seen describe as like giant nuts or pods, and that when the sailors sleep on the deck because it is hot, flit down on them, and then in the morning are found dead men, white as even Miss Lucy was. Good God, Professor, I said, starting up. Do you mean to tell me that Lucy was bitten by a bat, and that such a thing is here in London in the 19th century? And if there is a sample excerpt that we can pull for Dr. John Seward, there it is. Here in London in the 19th century. So you see how carefully, and again, right, we're going back to our first slide from tonight with Van Helsing, once again, building this rational argument. Do you know the mysteries of life and death? You, as a doctor, you're compelled to say no. I know that you kind of have a sense of them, but you are compelled to say no. Do you know the altogether of comparative anatomy and can say wherefore the qualities of brutes are in some men and not in others, right? Wherefore, of course, going back to our first literary interpretation 101, wherefore meaning why here. Why are some men brutes and some not? This is the physiognomy, right? We were talking about this before with Harker interpreting Dracula's character from his physical features, right? Again, we're still in this very Victorian mindset. Can you tell me why, when other spiders die small and soon, that one great spider lived for centuries in the tower of the old Spanish church and grew and grew? This is upsetting, and I am going to take the time just to take a look at this. This is a clip from volume 88 of Edinburgh Magazine and Literary Miscellany, published by Archibald Constable and Company in 1821 as part of a collection of, a miscellany, in fact, a collection of scientific news items from around the world. We get this clip here. Quote, "The sexton of the church of St. Eustace at Paris, amazed to find frequently a particular lamp extinct early, and yet the oil consumed only, sat up several nights to perceive the cause. At length he detected that a spider of surprising size came down the cord to drink the oil. A still more extraordinary instance of the same kind occurred during the year 1751 in the Cathedral of Milan. A vast spider was observed there, which fed on the oil of the lamps. Monsieur Morland of the Academy of Sciences has described this spider and furnished a drawing of it. It weighed 4 pounds and was sent to the Emperor of Austria and is now in the Imperial Museum at Vienna." Reassuringly, no, it isn't. Because, good Lord, a 4-pound spider would be quite something. For context, the largest documented spider in the world, the Goliath bird eater in northern South America, weighs a little less than half a pound, which is still, gross, too much, not allowed, absolutely illegal. That is too much for a spider. Spider, that is not for you. But 4 pounds would clearly be much, much too far. Interestingly, of course, there is no record of a 4-pound spider in the Natural History Museum in Vienna, or indeed anywhere else on Earth. But there is a weird picture of a very large spider crab that resides in the 1889 Natural History Museum in Vienna, a place that I was recently researching for another podcast that I record, Don't You Know Me By Now, a podcast on Richard Linklater's Before trilogy. I was looking at these buildings that appear in a beautiful montage sequence. Right after Jesse and Celine leave the record shop, they walk past the twin art history and natural history museums there in Vienna. So I just indulged myself and went on an hour-long deep dive into those museums, which are just fascinating and brilliant, as so much of Vienna is. So we're seeing what Van Helsing is doing, right? He is building this argument step by step. Do you know, are you a master of the mysteries of life and death? Have you heard of these spiders? Why, when spiders are small, should this one spider be big? Can you explain that, right? Van Helsing clearly taking this, transposing it to Spain, I guess, but otherwise kind of reporting this story as he himself may have heard it. Why, that is a mystery. Why should that be? Why should there be vampires out on the Pampas, and elsewhere? Why should these mysterious things occur? Why should these bats hang from trees? And you can see him leading Seward step by step to the conclusion that Seward appropriately arrives at, right? He starts out just by talking about the mysteries of life and death, then into like this weird cryptozoological tangent where he's talking about the giant oil-drinking spider, and then onward to specifically bats, specifically vampires, right? The drinking of blood, even to the sailors themselves who rest on the decks of their ship because it is hot and wake white and drained, just like Lucy was. He leads him down this garden path, step by step, conclusion by conclusion, and it's inescapable. He manages to circumvent. If he had sat Seward down and simply said, well, you know, there are bats, there are vampires out there in the world that do this, that was probably what happened, right? Don't you concur? Don't you concur, my friend? You who have trusted me these weeks? We know that Seward would not indeed have concurred because Quincy Morris did exactly that, right? He tells the story of his mare out on the Pampas, right? The Pampas, Argentina and like northern South Africa, northern South America. Get my continents entirely mixed up. Why don't I? But we know that Seward is not responsive to that because Quincy Morris tried exactly that strategy, or at least opened the door to that fairly obvious conclusion, a conclusion which Seward had already preempted, right? He had already seen the wounds on Lucy's neck and thought, that's probably where that blood went. Well, that's obviously impossible, so I don't know, nothing could have happened. There's no explanation for this that fits inside of my worldview, therefore I cannot seek to explain it. This is, of course, going to lead us to our next slide here as Van Helsing really lays out his a more developed, more nuanced approach to rationality as he understands it. Well, I shall tell you. My thesis is this. I want you to believe. To believe what? To believe in things that you cannot. Let me illustrate. I heard once of an American who so defined faith, that which enables us to believe things which we know to be untrue. For one, I follow that man. He meant that we should have an open mind and not let a little bit of truth check the rush of the big truth like a small rock does a railway truck. We get the small truth first. Good, we keep him and we value him, but all the same, we must not let him think himself all the truth in the universe. Then you want me not to let some previous conviction inure the receptivity of my mind with regard to some strange matter? Do I read your lesson aright? And of course, he does. And this is, honestly, I think one of the best takes on open-minded skeptical rationalism that I've ever heard in my life. This is a really nice, developed argument. It is a subtle, and for those of you who may be coming late, I have read a little on this kind of argument because my undergrad was joint English and philosophy, so I kind of I've been exposed to more philosophical papers than most normal people ought to be, and I still carry with me the track marks of that, right? The scars of that, the familiar itch that needs the familiar scratch. So this is a really great kind of primer, a 101 on skeptical rationality that keeps us anchored in these notions of truth and fact, right? There are things in the world which are simply true. We ought to observe them. We ought to measure them. We ought not to let a previous fact, which ought now to be amended or at least placed in its proper context, prevent us from accepting this larger fact. The American, I once heard of an American who so defined faith. This is, of course, Mark Twain, probably the most quotable American ever, certainly the most quotable American of this period. This is taken from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The quote is, "Having faith is believing in something you just know ain't true," which has a certain elegance to it. True, too. So Van Helsing concludes here that Seward's sense of the world, his sense of the geography of the possible is insufficient, and again leads him to these conclusions. He dramatically concludes that the wounds found on the children of Hampstead are being made by Lucy. And then we pick up chapter 15 with a continuation of the same conversation. Just a chapter break in the middle of this, just for dramatic effect, it seems to me. We then cut quickly out to Seward's kind of post hoc discussion of this, his after-action report from the hospital and the graveyard. It's funny to note, let me pull down this slide for just a moment. It's funny to note that Dr. Vincent immediately, Dr. Vincent, the doctor from the hospital, of course, immediately identifies the possibility of a vampire, right? He immediately identifies, there are these crazy bats that I've heard about out there in the Pampas. I once heard the story of them drinking this American guy's mare just like bone dry. He immediately identifies it, as well as noting, interestingly, that the Bloofer Lady game that the children are playing came on the heels of a Red Riding Hood game. right? The Red Riding Hood game, presumably inspired by the wolf that went so recently missing from the Regent's Park Zoo. So we're building again a comparison here between this monstrous story and a similarly monstrous story, right? The Bloofer lady might be beautiful, but that doesn't mean that she is not a monster. It doesn't mean that she is not dangerous. The children are playing the same kind of game as they would with this, I was going to say imaginary wolf. Of course, the wolf, all too real, but not really stalking around Hampstead looking for children. They investigate the graveyard and the mausoleum in which Lucy was so recently interred, only to discover that the body, of course, is not inside. They pierce the lead-lined coffin. They keep their vigil in the graveyard at night, finding the unwounded child and seeing this white shape flit back to the tomb. Again, it's hard, I think, for modern readers to be really engaged in the movement of the mystery, though it's easier to be engaged in the moment-to-moment storytelling, because again, I think that Stoker is a very effective storyteller, particularly, it's a difficult thing to really like John Seward. I think I don't have a great affection for him, but he's certainly capable of delivering these very effective narrative passages, right? As a reporter of events, he's at least as effective as anyone else in the book. I think he's right up there, top tier. So we then discover Lucy's body back in its resting place in the coffin. Seward wrestles with the philosophical implications of something being both demonstrably true and also simultaneously impossible. But Van Helsing has dark business in mind, and we're going to take a look at one of the most famous and influential pieces of all of Dracula. Here there is one thing that is different from all recorded. Here is some dual life that is not as the common. She was bitten by the vampire when she was in a trance, sleepwalking. Oh, you do not know that, friend John, but you shall know it all later. And in trance could he best come to take more blood. In trance she died. And in trance, she is undead too. So it is that she differs from all other. Usually when the undead sleep at home, as he spoke, he made a comprehensive sweep of his arm to designate that what to a vampire was home. Their face show what they are. But this so sweet that was, when she not undead, she go back to the nothings of the common dead. There is no malign there, see? And so it make hard that I must kill her in her sleep. This turned my blood cold, and it began to dawn upon me that I was accepting Van Helsing's theories. But if she were really dead, what was there of terror in the idea of killing her? He looked up at me, and evidently saw the change in my face, for he said almost joyously, "Ah, you believe now." Undead. Here it is. The most influential word possibly that comes out of Dracula. More influential, I would argue, than Dracula himself. More influential than the repositioning of the word vampire. The word undead. The etymology of this is really interesting because it's actually been kicking around in English for a good long time, since like the 15th century, but it is an adjective. It's undead, U-N-D-E-D-E, and it means undying, right? It means immortal. It's not used as a specific noun, well, until now. Merriam-Webster credits the first appearance of the word in the modern sense to 1897, and Merriam-Webster plays coy with its sources, but that seems to be a direct link to Dracula, to this novel itself. Interestingly, the proposed title for Dracula was, the first title was The Dead Undead, and then that was revised by Stoker to The Undead. That was going to be the title of the book up to, I think, less than 2 weeks before the print run started, before publication. So it's a really last-minute change to alter it to Dracula. Is Dracula better than The Undead? I think so. I think it might be. I think it might be more penetrative in a commercial sense. I am not sure that the mass market would have picked up The Undead in the same way that they picked up Dracula. I think that sometimes a certain circumspection can be helpful when you're appealing to a mass market as a horror writer. You know, you can go and look at the extended career of Stephen King and his various swings toward kind of what literary legitimacy, or what he perceives as a kind of literary legitimacy, and how he moves both away from and then resolutely back to a particular kind of horror branding. I'm curious as to whether The Undead would have made the same penetration into the market as Dracula did. So again, right, this is really getting back to where we were at the beginning of this week's session, and the crucifix on the lips and the too soon and too late simultaneously being true, because from a narrative point of view, Van Helsing's explanation of Lucy's whole deal is kind of unclear. And again, right, I wonder to what degree Stoker here is pushing back against this idea of the comprehensive Victorian novel, and to what degree he's just leaving interesting and ominous space, to what degree he is just deliberately leaving things unclear, leaving spaces unanswered, questions unanswered, and to what degree he just hasn't properly formulated, the underlying rules of the system. And who's to say that he even needs to be particularly interested in formulating the underlying rules of a system? Hey, I just invoked Stephen King, the most successful horror writer of all time, a man who does not like to make consistent sets of rules. It would be fun, actually, as a part of Stars and Swords, to go and read Salem's Lot. That's one of my favorite Kings. I must not get distracted. We only have half an hour left, and it's still a long way to go. Let's see what we can do here to get through this. Regardless of his reasons, regardless of the underlying explanation, Stoker doesn't present us with a neat and tidy understanding of the vampire. Instead, we get all of these disparate elements, and we're left to kind of infer. We will get more from Van Helsing. He's not done laying out lore just yet. So we'll note here, too, that this is one of the first blurrings, in fact, of the word vampire, right? I just mentioned how the word vampire really, Bram Stoker's work is the inflection point at which it stops meaning bat and starts meaning, ominous aristocratic European dude with a penchant for plunging necklines and the ladies therein, because this is the first time that we really start to move it. She was bitten by the vampire when she was in a trance. Now, he does mean the bat, right? He is referring to the large bat that would feed on Lucy at her window. We saw that several times over. But he's also now familiar with Mina's journal, which means that Van Helsing, at least, is enfolding into his account here. He's enfolding into his understanding of the vampire, paren the bat, the vampire, paren Count Dracula, the ominous shadowy figure with the glowing red eyes atop the East Cliff, right? He's enfolding all of these things. Well, to some degree, he is unfolding it. To some degree, he has already unfolded it. Right? He clearly already has a broader sense of what is happening here than he is admitting at this time. But at least his apprehension of what happened to Lucy is now richer than it was before. I'll point out, too, that this is only the fourth use of the word vampire in the entire book, which I find staggering. The first comes early in the first chapter, right? We have Jonathan Harker consulting his polyglot dictionary and finding the two words that mean the same thing, either werewolf or vampire, right? You'll recall that, I'm sure. The second instance comes all the way in Quincy's description of his mare on the Pampas in South America, one of those big bats they call a vampire. And the third use comes from just earlier in this chapter when Dr. Vincent immediately jumps to, probably a vampire. Seems to me could definitely be a vampire has wounded these children in such a way, right? Some wild specimen of the south of a more malignant species. Some sailors may have brought one home and it managed to escape, or even from the zoological gardens, a young one may have got loose, or one be bred there from a vampire. So, for instances, we're already blending the meaning between the traditional and the modern senses of these words. And of course, basically past this point, vampire will 100% mean Dracula and 0% mean bat. In fact, it has completely fallen out of modern usage. To mean a vampire in the traditional sense, we now exclusively say vampire bat. It would be strange to ever use the word vampire and be indicating one of those flying mice. I guess it does formulate a little bit, right? It doesn't always mean, aristocratic European men. It eventually means, sexy dudes in leather jackets, sparkly skin, that kind of stuff. When Van Helsing talks about vampires being at rest in their home, too, and the malice that is revealed there, this I take to be an allusion to what Jonathan Harker saw on the face of Dracula all the way back in Castle Dracula, toward the end of that sequence, that horrible visage that forced the spade, you'll remember, with which Harker is striking at the face of Dracula to turn aside, right? It's this underlying innate malice and hideousness that cannot be disguised when the vampire is in its resting state. This presumably also is what the first mate sees on the Demeter, that drives the last of his sanity from him and sends him leaping from the deck of the ship into the water. Excellent. Okay. Try to keep track of all of my slides, and we still have a distance to go here. And also check the live chat. Everything here is going very well. Excellent. So by contrast, of course, Lucy is beautiful because she is undamaged, because she is in this half vampire state, this undead state. Again, we can't really filter out exactly what this means. We'll get to it. We'll get a little additional meaning actually not so long from now, so maybe we'll circle back to that in just a moment. Van Helsing knows that he should take action right now, but he hesitates partly because she's beautiful, and also less defensibly, less justifiably. He hesitates because Lucy is in some sense Arthur's property. Lucy belongs in some sense to Arthur. So Van Helsing believes he wants to give Arthur the opportunity to come and kind of be present and kind of exert an authority over what happens to Lucy's body, even though she is already deceased. And we can maybe forgive the plotting of this. Again, we're going to get a lot of details of the comings and goings of these men just to fill these pages. But it doesn't feel great that Van Helsing is unwilling to take action here against a creature that he knows to be a monster, right? He could take action immediately. It might mean going and getting his tools, but he can be back here in 20 minutes and take care of business. Instead, he's going to delay by 2 whole days, believing that nothing bad will happen in the interim. This is perhaps Van Helsing's most egregious mistake to date. He writes then to Seward, including the interesting observation that because Lucy is young as undead, that's the quote that he uses in his subsequent letter to Seward, because she is young as undead, she will be more susceptible to the crucifix and the garlic, which is actually a really strong and interesting bit of lore, right? That is the kind of fuel for the lore fire that will warm us through the night. That's a jumping off point for all kinds of speculation as we consider how vampires function in this world. If we're inclined to treat them as scientific creatures, if we're inclined to approach this deliberately non-rational set of circumstances with a rational mind, right? This is one of the ways in which Stoker is kind of playing with his audience and the expectations of the Victorian reader. This is where he notes to, as I mentioned earlier, right, that Dracula has the strength of the man that gave their blood to Lucy. He writes, quote, "He has always the strength in his hand of 20 men, even we 4 who gave our strength to Miss Lucy. It also is all to him." So we have contributed to the strength of this monster by contributing our strength to the ailing Lucy Westenra. From there, so much more process. The exhausting process, frankly, of explaining to Arthur what must be done. So much of this is repetition from the previous scene. But again, I do not think that this is sloppy writing. I don't think that it's careless plotting. I don't think it's Stoker just filling the pages. I think that he is building compelling arguments to both the Victorian reader and to the Victorian characters who are having trouble comprehending exactly what is possible within this space. And I guess I should pull back from my association of this strict Victorian rationalism with everybody who read Dracula when it was published in 1897, because of course this is a cultural ideal. It is a social standard, but the thing about social standards is that they are never universal. In actuality, they're never universal. There were people in London at the time who read this book and absolutely believed in vampires, European aristocrats who would drink your blood, and perhaps even domestic aristocrats that would try the same kind of thing. Those billionaires, am I right? So credulity would have been far more common than we are asserting within the pages of Dracula, right? We have these very forthright archetypal kind of men. As I mentioned back when we introduced the 4 men who orbit Lucy, they are each themselves a perfect paragon of their type, right? We have the great nobleman, the English aristocrat, Arthur Holmwood. We have Dr. Seward, who is in fact archetypal, who is perfect in his form because he is so rational, though his worldview is limited. We have Van Helsing, the foreigner, who is more informed, and we have Quincey Morris, the man of action, right? The conqueror of the new world. Very loaded imperialistic terms here too. But this a man of the future, if you like, less concerned with courtesy and the formalities of Victorian culture. So each of these men, and in effect, the entire extended cast of Dracula, are themselves paradigmatic in their way. They are themselves kind of apotheotic of their own strands and strains of Victorian character. Even as we pointed out before, Mina on the one hand of Victorian femininity and Lucy on the other. In fact, we're going to see a fantastic contrast of those two right now, because we are going to jump into chapter 16, whereupon our intrepid heroes return to the churchyard only to find Lucy's coffin empty. Van Helsing seals it up with some crumbled communion wafers. In Catholic theology, the actual transubstantiated body of Christ here warding the tomb so that Lucy cannot return. So much more powerful than the crucifix. The image of Christ here, the actual body and presence of Christ in crumbled wafer form. That sounded far more dismissive than I intended it to, but here we are. Words have their own meanings. Let's take a look at this slide as we see again Lucy. He pointed, and far down the avenue of yews we saw a white figure advance, a dim white figure which held something dark at its breast. The figure stopped, and at the moment a ray of moonlight fell between the masses of driving clouds and showed in startling prominence a dark-haired woman dressed in the cerements of the grave. We could not see the face, for it was bent down over what we saw to be a fair-haired child. There was a pause and a sharp little cry, such as a child gives in its sleep, or a dog as it lies before the fire and dreams. We were starting forward, but the professor's warning hand, seen by us as he stood behind a yew tree, kept us back. And then as we looked, the white figure moved forwards again. It was now near enough for us to see it clearly, and the moonlight still held. My own heart grew cold as ice, and I could hear the gasp of Arthur as we recognized the features of Lucy Westenra. Lucy Westenra, but yet, how changed! The sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. Van Helsing stepped out, and obedient to his gesture, we all advanced too. The four of us ranged in a line before the door of the tomb. Van Helsing raised his lantern and drew the slide. By the concentrated light that fell on Lucy's face, we could see her lips were crimson with fresh blood, and that the stream had trickled over her chin and stained the purity of her lawn death robe. Some minor details then before we get to the big stuff. The phrase dark-haired woman is sometimes taken as evidence that Lucy's hair has changed color because Lucy was previously asserted to be blonde, but this is much more ambiguous. The only mention of Lucy's hair prior to this is back in chapter 12 when Arthur arrives to witness Lucy's death. Seward describes Lucy's hair as laying on the pillow in its usual sunny ripples, which some take to mean that she was blonde at the time, thus this transformation. And I don't think that this is true for two reasons. The first is just interpretation. It is just reading the text. I think that sunny ripples could simply mean that her hair, freshly brushed by Van Helsing in advance of Arthur's arrival, that her hair is glossy. It's reflecting the bright sunlight, which Seward says is streaming in. And the second is more of a narrative maneuver, or rather the anticipation of a narrative maneuver, because if Lucy is only now dark-haired, then A, that transformation would be obvious, right? It would be mentioned, presumably, and B, she would look less like herself. She would look less like the woman that these men all in their way, or three of these men had loved, and one of these men had cared for in her dying moments, right? And if she looks less like that woman, then the emotional torque that is being applied to these men would be similarly decreased. So I absolutely see Lucy as being consistently dark-haired, and I think that the sunny ripples here is acknowledging the glossy cleanliness, the shampoo-ad quality of her hair after it's been lovingly brushed by Van Helsing, a moment which I'm sure was not at all weird for anyone present, rather than the fact that her hair used to be blonde and is now dark. We also get a few words here on Lucy's attire, right? Cerements are the pieces of waxed cloth used to shroud and wrap the dead. Lawn, as used here in the last line, is this gauzy, thin kind of semi-transparent cotton linen-like cloth. So you can imagine how, scandalous Lucy's appearance is to these Victorian gentlemen, all diaphanous and semi-transparent. We also get the language here used to describe her appearance. Hardness, adamantite. Adamantite comes from the Latin word adamant, right? A Latin word for a hard, unbreakable substance, like a mythically hard and unbreakable substance. The word adamus comes into English and gives us the word diamond. They share a common root here. So here again, we're seeing all of this this inhuman hardness that we associated with the vampire brides all the way back in Dracula's castle, right? You'll remember Jonathan Harker talking about how hard their skin was, how hard they seemed, how the mineralistic quality of their being. So again, we have that reference, and again, we also have, also taken from the Vampire Brides, all of this sensuality, this sexuality, this voluptuousness, a word that is used frequently through this part of the book. Sexuality, sensuality, voluptuousness, all associated with evil, with temptation. But that is being subverted here at least a little, because what we're really seeing from Lucy in this moment, as she emerges from the avenue of yews, right, carrying this child, is not just a scandalous sensuality. It is not just a predatory sexuality. It is not just these things which are, you know, unfeminine in ways that have already been covered by previous chapters in this book. Now we're getting something new, because what we're seeing here as she holds this child to her breast and feeds from it is a fundamental perversion of motherhood, of this maternal instinct. Not maternal instinct even, but maternal actuality, right? Maternalism, we might think of it. That very kind of, again, citing the Victorian mindset here, right? Citing Victorian social standards. That fundamentally feminine thing, that thing to which all women ultimately aspire, is here being twisted to its darkest possible purpose, right? That she is feeding from the child and then casually discards it to the ground and is stained with its own lifeblood, right? The actual inversion of the act of breastfeeding and giving life through the transmission of fluid from one body into another, right? The traditional association between mother and child here absolutely starkly inverted to cruel and horrible effect here. This, I think, and you know, we can maybe speculate. The argument against this, to anticipate the response, the argument against this is Van Helsing talking earlier about her being a young undead, right? And about crucifixes and garlic being more efficacious against Lucy because she has not yet come into her maturity as a vampire. And perhaps we might speculate that that is the reason that she is hunting and feeding on children, because they can't put up much of a fight. They can't maybe put up as much fight as a grown man could, or even a grown woman could. That's possible. It's also possible that Lucy's whole deal is this perversion of the maternal instinct, is this perversion of the maternal role that we've seen, that is why she's predating upon children, is that something more fundamental is being twisted here. And does that open the door to some possibly Freudian interpretations about what the vampire brides, one of whom we can be sure is or not sure perhaps, but one of whom we can be fairly sure is the mother of the other two, right? And their relationship with Jonathan Harker. Yes, right? We talked way back when about the turning, the inversion of the penetrative act there, right? Clouded in all of this feminine, voluptuous sensuality and sexuality that we've seen here. Yeah, there are some deeply sexual things going on that are manifested in different ways. Is Dracula ultimately about sex? Yes. Vampires are ultimately about sex, right? Like the suppressed desire of the Byronic hero is given in the Victorian era, and crucially thereafter, is given voice by this appetite, by this hunger, by this need, by this desire, right? We can talk about penetration, and we can talk about the you know, as we talked about with the Vampire Brides, right? This kind of this scandalous sucking and licking and this very sensual collection of acts and sensations that are described there. Yes, Dracula is fundamentally a book about sex. Again, is it a book about homosexual sex? Is it a book about homosexual relationships? No, not really. We're going to get some more opportunities to kind of take a queer reading of this book, but we're not there yet. Where we are, though, is at the final moment of Lucy Westenra 2.0. We have this confrontation in front of the tomb, but Van Helsing's protection wins out. And Lucy is trapped there for a moment until Helsing breaks his own barrier here of the crumbled wafers, and Lucy slips back into the coffin, passing, crucially, you'll note, quote, through the interstice where scarce a knife blade could have gone. So the method has paid off, you guys. We now have proof from the text that vampires can do this kind of thing. We speculated that was true, of course, but now we know for sure that vampires can take this incorporeal form and move where it would otherwise be impossible to move. That the barrier of the crushed communion wafers was much more, technically, the barrier of the transubstantiated body of Christ was much more effective, was infinitely more effective at barring the passage of Lucy's vampiric form than the stone blocks, whatever, the marble construction of her tomb here. Okay. I'm looking nervously at the time and deciding how much we can cover. We can do it. We can do it. We can at least get to the end of this chapter, though we might not get to the end of the next one. Let's see what we can do. Let's move on to talk about the final moment here. They return, of course, the following afternoon. They scatter, knowing now that Lucy is sated for the night and that there will be no further activity. They go home, they prepare themselves, and then return to finally take care of business here with an accounting of Van Helsing's tools. She seemed like a nightmare of Lucy as she lay there. The pointed teeth, the blood-stained, voluptuous mouth, which it made one shudder to see, the whole carnal and unspirited appearance, seeming like a devilish mockery of Lucy's sweet purity. Van Helsing, with his usual methodicalness, began taking the various contents from his bag and placing them ready for use. First, he took out a soldering iron and some plumbing solder, and then a small oil lamp, which gave out, when lit in a corner of the tomb, gas which burned at a fierce heat with a blue flame. Then his operating knives, which he placed to hand, and at last a round wooden stake, some 2.5 or 3 inches thick and about 3 feet long. One end of it was hardened by charring in the fire and was sharpened to a fine point. With this stake came a heavy hammer, such as in households is used in the coal cellar for breaking the lumps. To me, a doctor's preparations for work of any kind are stimulating and bracing, but the effects of these things on both Arthur and Quincy was to cause them a sort of consternation. They both, however, kept their courage and remained silent and quiet. I myself love to see a doctor lay out his implements: a soldering iron, some solder, a blowtorch, a large stake, big old hammer. You know, the things that would reassure you if you were settling down to surgery in any of the nation's finest operating theatres. Let's, for a moment, crucially, as we consider just the stake, push all thoughts of Buffy the Vampire Slayer out of our heads and really picture the stake. Take the moment to really consider the size and the weight of this thing. This is not for piercing the heart and magically undoing the essence of the vampire, right? No vampire is going to be dusted by this thing. This is a 3-foot-long length of wood, as thick, if not thicker, as a Coke can. It is hardened and sharpened into a point. Its purpose, and this is true going back into the folkloric roots of vampires and vampire slaying, its purpose is not magical, right? There's nothing special about the stake. The stake is employed to literally pin the vampire to the earth so that it cannot rise and escape its tomb. This is a preventative measure. It's not necessarily going to kill the vampire, but it will stop it from wandering around and biting people. It is a physical barrier. This is where Van Helsing says that if Arthur had succumbed to Lucy either in the moment of her death or the previous night in the graveyard, which again just kind of challenges our understanding of where and when Lucy became what she now is. If Arthur had succumbed to her, then he too would have died. He would have become Nosferatu, a word which takes on all kinds of meanings actually going forward in vampire myth. He includes here too the tantalizing detail that if Arthur had become Nosferatu, then he himself would have gone off and created, sired, bred, caused more vampires like Lucy and by extension Dracula, right? There's this weird kind of circle of life thing happening here, that vampires can create these other creatures that can go off and themselves create more vampires, which leads us back to the vampire population problem, which leads us back to this open question as to why, if this were so efficacious, would the world not be completely populated by vampires? Asterisk. Maybe because of this miasmatic influence, maybe this self-defeating kind of corruptive evil that spreads, large-scale thoughts possibly for next week's discussion. I'm really coming down to it, but we're going to push on. We're going to see what we can do here. Let's move on, in fact, directly to our next slide. This is, of course, Van Helsing. Before we do anything, let me tell you this. It is out of the lore and experience of the ancients and of those who have studied the powers of the undead. When they become such, there comes with the change the curse of immortality. They cannot die, but must go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. For all that die from the preying of the undead become themselves undead and prey on their kind.
And so the circle goes on ever widening, like the ripples from the stone thrown in the water. Friend Arthur, if you admit that kiss which you know of before poor Lucy died, or again last night as you opened your arms to her, you would in time, when you had died, have become the Nosferatu, as they call it in Eastern Europe, and with old time make more of those undeads that so fill us with horror. The career of this so unhappy dear lady is but just begun. Those children in whose blood she suck are not as yet so much the worse. But if she live on undead, more and more they lose their blood, and by her power over them they come to her, and so she draw their blood with that so wicked mouth. But if she die in truth, then all cease. The tiny wounds of the throat disappear, and they go back to their play, unknowing ever of what has been. So there, the reference to the Nosferatu, but also, crucially, another element of vampire lore. The big old reset button. If you kill the vampire, then everyone who became a vampire because of the vampire stops being a vampire. And here again, just to confuse our understanding of the lore, right? Van Helsing points out that if Lucy is properly killed, if the head is severed and the mouth stuffed with garlic, as is about to happen, in fact, that the children's wounds will close and that they will be restored to some semblance of normalcy, right? Except that the closing of the wounds on Lucy's throat was actually the herald of her final death. You'll remember that that is what told Van Helsing that Lucy was not long for this earth. Let's move into, I absolutely have to quote, yes, we'll comfortably finish this chapter, and we may progress just a little further. We'll see how we go. This is the moment of the death of Lucy Westenra, the second death of Lucy Westenra. Quote, "The thing in the coffin writhed, and in a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with a crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, whilst the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up around it. His face was set, and high duty seemed to shine through it. The sight of it gave us courage, so that our voices seemed to ring through the little vault. And then the writhing and quivering of the body became less, and the teeth ceased to champ, and the face to quiver. Finally it lay still. The terrible task was over." The slaying of the vampire. The comparison to Thor here, interesting and of course much more evocative to the Victorian mind than to the Chris Hemsworth adult modern mind. But you'll remember too how Dracula himself invokes Thor, right? He invokes the Norse pantheon as he pictures the berserkers coming down from the north in his description to Jonathan Harker of his bloodline, his own personal family history, abstracted out to mean the history of his vampiric lineage, perhaps. Again, we get no more information on that. This is extraordinarily powerful. And again, right, the figure of Arthur as this exemplar, this paragon of nobility. Here, godlike in his power, leading by example, absolutely, but also radiating this high duty. High duty seemed to shine through it. It's a very effective bit of characterization for Arthur. We must also observe, again, if the act of biting the neck of one's victim in order to take blood from it is penetrative and sexual, then this is all the more so, of course, right? There are some, I think, legitimate readings of this scene as a moment of sexual transgression, right? It's hard to say sexual assault. It's hard to describe it in terms that we would use for a human victim of this action, right? Obviously that would transform the scene entirely in its shape and flavor, but there is something physical here that we must acknowledge to be parodic in its mimicry and its replication of the sexual act, right? The penetration, the spurting, the eventual stillness, and of course le petit mort, right? The little death here that has accompanied the great death of Lucy Westenra, now being followed by a second death that removes her effectively from the story. Van Helsing encourages Arthur to kiss Lucy once more and reassures him that her soul now is with God and that they will be ultimately reunited, which is, it strikes me, at least presumptuous. We then remove the head. We perform the necessary sequence of events, the processes necessary, again, right, the procedural processes necessary. Though, since Van Helsing already interprets Lucy as being saved and redeemed, it is hard, therefore, to justify the second act. I don't know. He reassures Arthur that Lucy's soul now is untainted, right? That it is over, that the beast is dead, and then takes the head, severs it, stuffs it with garlic flowers, and that is the last action. So I don't know wherein the salvation lies. I don't know what it is here that really redeems Lucy, that literally saves her soul, as Van Helsing claims, and what is a more pragmatic response to the presence of vampires. Could this head itself be used for ill purpose? Could the body itself be used for ill purpose if, the stake were removed, if it were reclaimed by Dracula? We just don't have information to speculate, unfortunately. The greater threat, however, remains, right? That is the end of Dracula Part 1. But Dracula Part 2 is waiting for us because the greater threat remains. And having put together this very effective Scooby gang of, one member of every class here, and I mean that in the D&D sense, but also obviously in the socially hierarchical sense, having put together the Scooby gang of every single class, we might as well go fight the big bad. We might as well undertake our next great mission. We've covered 4 chapters, the pace, the dizzying pace. Let me see, how much do I have? Yeah, you know what? We've only got 2 slides for the next chapter. Let's move swiftly. And we will close out here chapter 17 too, despite my promise of a hard out here. Mina arrives in town, noting that Jonathan has gone up to Whitby on business. We'll get an account of that in a moment. This is really when we get into the compilation of this epistolary document, right? We're starting to think of these things as significant documents unto themselves. And so we start putting together the account that we, the readers, have already moved through. And this is really, I think, when the pace of the novel starts to slip. We get a lot of this proceduralism. We get a lot of process here. We get a lot of shoe leather, the toing, the froing, the going, the coming, and the compilation of this document itself. This, Van Helsing gives Seward Mina's journal, tells him to read it carefully. Then Seward meets Mina from the train. They will eventually as I said, Mina will transcribe his phonographs while he reads her diary, and they will become familiar with one another through their own records, right? Which is kind of sweet and kind of justifies the epistolary existence of this book as a whole. I did want to call out the moment when... I guess this is after Jonathan goes to Whitby at the request of Mr. Billington, who you'll remember is the solicitor who takes the delivery in Whitby of the Demeter's cargo and then assures its passage to Carfax. We got their letters earlier in the documentary account, which Jonathan now recovers from Whitby for inclusion in that documentary account. And we just start talking about, the cases at Carfax, the 50 great cases at Carfax. Seward starts putting all of the pieces together too, and we get this wonderful moment for Mina to comfort Arthur, which I focus on primarily because it's a very sweet moment. Secondarily, because it's an interesting moment of Mina as a modern Victorian woman, and tertiarily, because it is a counterpoint to the perverted femininity that we saw from Lucy earlier, right? Because while Lucy is twisting this maternal instinct into something dark and cruel and selfish and macabre, well, let's see what Mina is doing here. Quote, "In an instant, the poor dear fellow was overwhelmed with grief. It seemed to me that all he had of late been suffering in silence found a vent at once. He grew quite hysterical, and raising his open hands, beat his palms together in a perfect agony of grief. He stood up and then sat down again, and then tears rained down his cheeks. I felt an infinite pity for him, and opened my arms unthinkingly. With a sob, he laid his head on my shoulder and cried like a wearied child, whilst he shook with emotion. We women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters when the mother spirit is invoked. I felt this big, sorrowing man's head resting on me as though it were that of a baby that might someday lie on my bosom, and I stroked his hair as though he were my own child. I never thought at the time how strange it all was." So, Lucy as the parody, the dark, twisted reflection of the mother, Mina not only embodying the opposite, right? Embodying the, again, per Victorian social standards, the pure and virtuous and inevitable maternal instinct that all women must feel, but also articulating what she is feeling, right? Also aware that this is odd, but also natural, that this is a thing that she feels, but it is existing somewhat outside of the social framework. I never thought at the time how strange it was, because to be clear, this is pretty weird, right? She is a married woman in a room with a strange man that she really, really does not know. She is unchaperoned, and a moment before Arthur breaks down, she wonders if he will think her forward for taking his hand. And now they're in an embrace, an intimate embrace. She is associating him with, the child that will one day lay on her breast. This is so profoundly emotionally intimate, but it is rescued because it is rescued from, imprudence, from inappropriate social conduct. It is rescued from being scandalous by Mina's maternal instinct, this infinite maternal instinct that she so describes. She concludes here this relatively short chapter. In fact, this is the last slide that we're going to look at here. This is the similar encounter that Mina has, because, hey, the two things that we do in this chapter are really put together some documents in order to make a novel that will one day be a bestseller. We really start putting together Dracula by Bram Stoker. And we really take our time to emphasize just how great Mina Harker is. I'm interested intellectually in the former, but I'm emotionally so gratified by the latter because Mina rules. Quote, "I wish I could comfort all who suffer from the heart. Will you let me be your friend? And will you come to me for comfort if you need it? You will know later on why I speak." He saw that I was in earnest, and stooping, took my hand, and raising it to his lips, kissed it. It seemed but poor comfort to so brave and unselfish a soul, and impulsively I bent over and kissed him. The tears rose in his eyes, and there was a momentary choking in his throat. He said, quite calmly, "Little girl, you will never regret the true-hearted kindness, so long as ever you live." Then he went into the study to his friend. Little girl, the very words he had used to Lucy, and but he proved himself a friend. Mina, capable of crossing all lines, of communicating in a very Van Helsingian way, right? Just this enormity of heart, just this abundance of care and fellow feeling. I'm already 5 minutes tonight. Good work, you guys. A quick update on our schedule before I wrap up very quick because, as I said, I have to go. Next week, we are going to conclude Dracula. That's right. I said it. We are very close now. We have a significant reading about the same length as this week's reading, in fact. But next week, I can afford to relax into the full 2 hours available to me here of an evening. So it's probably going to be another long one. Don't necessarily expect episodes of this length all the way forward, although I'm looking at my schedule and thinking, yes, you could probably expect pretty long episodes coming up because we have to conclude Dracula next week in order to make space for what I guess will, in 2 weeks' time, become a Christmas tradition. This Christmas, we're going to follow on our discussion of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe last year and look at Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis. We are going to return to Narnia for a somewhat compressed, let me show you the slide here, a somewhat compressed 3-week schedule here on December 19th, 26th, and 2nd. Yes, I will be broadcasting on Boxing Day. I cannot promise to be completely, devoid of a good fine red wine that evening, but we're going to talk about Prince Caspian. I'm so excited to talk about it. I accidentally saw the first, 20 or 25 minutes of the movie adaptation the other day, which is not very good, unfortunately. The movie adaptations of the Narnia series really did turn very quickly into diminishing returns. But there's stuff in this book that I absolutely love and cannot wait to talk about. So we're going to conclude with Dracula next week with part 8. We're then going to spend 3 weeks on Prince Caspian. And that means that on January the 9th, we will begin our journey into the Silmarillion. Between here and there, we're also definitely going to have that bonus episode on Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. That will be available over on the Patreon page. And somewhere, I'm not entirely sure where as yet, it remains to be seen, I'm hoping to put together a response, a review, a first take on the forthcoming Middle-earth movie, The War of the Rohirrim, the animated film that is coming out next week. That is dependent on some timing and some scheduling so that I can get to the theater, so that I can see the movie, maybe even twice, so that I can compose some notes, so that I can have some opinions, so that I can sit down here in front of the microphone and share them with you. Stay tuned for that, I guess. And obviously, I will mark all spoilers with regard to War of the Rohirrim very clearly. Spoilers for Prince Caspian, not so much. You guys should probably have read that already, but it's going to be a really fun adventure as we continue to move forward in our exploration of genre fiction. So next week, December 12th, we conclude Dracula. Please spread the word about this podcast if you enjoy this ramshackle endeavor that we have undertaken here together. Pledge your support over at patreon.com/nextweek. word. You can throw me a couple bucks a month over there and get access to all the bonus episodes, or you can just follow that page for free if you want access to the live links for these live YouTube sessions. If you want to join me live on YouTube and have your comments appear as a part of the show and just kind of chat with everyone who's here, then you can absolutely do that. Just head on over to the Patreon page and just follow it for free. No money need change hands for those links to be received. Thanks for listening. That's going to do it. As always, let's turn again to Van Helsing, right? Shall you not all help me? Have we learned to believe? All of us, is it not so? And since so, do we not see our duty? Yes. And do we not promise to go on to the bitter end? Each in turn, we took his hand, and the promise was made. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you all next week. Good night.